The evening sky was painted in shades of orange and pink as Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. He had been on the job for over 15 years, and while most days felt like a blur of routine stops and mundane paperwork, there were moments that made him feel alive again, moments where he could exercise his instincts honed by years of experience. Tonight seemed uneventful at first glance, but something about the sleek black sedan pulling out of the parking garage caught his attention. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the car glide smoothly onto the street. There was nothing overtly suspicious about it. The driver obeyed traffic signals, signaled before turning, and maintained a steady speed. But something gnawed at him. Maybe it was the way the driver adjusted the rearview mirror with an almost exaggerated motion, or how they glanced briefly into their side mirror as if checking for someone behind them. To anyone else, these actions might have seemed normal, but to Mark they hinted at nervousness. Curiosity got the better of him. He decided to run the license plate through the system, tapping the numbers into his dashboard computer. As he waited for the results, he kept his gaze fixed on the sedan, following it at a safe distance. The response came back quicker than expected, flashing across the screen in bold red letters. Stolen vehicle. Reported missing 2 days ago. Mark's pulse quickened. This wasn't just another hunch, it was confirmed now. Someone was driving a stolen car, and it was his duty to intervene. Without hesitation, he flicked on the swirling blue and red lights mounted atop his cruiser and accelerated to pull the vehicle over. The sedan slowed down obediently and pulled to the curb, its tires crunching against the gravel shoulder. Mark took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for what lay ahead. You never knew who you'd encounter during a traffic stop. A scared teenager, a seasoned criminal, or even someone desperate enough to resist arrest. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his service weapon. As he approached the driver's side window, the door opened, and the driver stepped out. Mark froze for a split second. Standing before him was a woman dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blazer, pencil skirt, and polished heels. Her posture radiated confidence, and her expression remained calm despite the flashing lights and tense atmosphere. She looked directly at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Is there a problem?" Mark blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. This wasn't what he had anticipated. Most people in this situation would be visibly shaken, stuttering excuses or fumbling for documents. But this woman exuded authority, almost as though she were the one questioning him. Still, he reminded himself not to let appearances cloud his judgment. Stolen cars didn't discriminate based on dress code. "I need to see your license and registration, ma'am," he replied firmly, keeping his tone professional. "Your vehicle has been flagged as reported stolen." The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her purse and retrieved her wallet, pulling out her driver's license. Then, she opened the car door and leaned inside to grab the registration from the glove compartment. Mark couldn't help but notice how composed she was throughout the process. Not hurried, not defensive, it was almost unsettling. "Here you go," she said, handing over the documents. "My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm a judge at the county courthouse. This car belongs to my brother Marcus. He lent it to me because mine is currently in the shop." Mark scanned the ID carefully. Sure enough, it matched the face standing in front of him. Evelyn Carter, age 42, with an address listed, in one of the city's more affluent neighborhoods. The name sounded familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. Could this really be a misunderstanding? Or was she using her position to deflect suspicion? He radioed dispatch to verify her identity, all while maintaining a watchful eye on her. Evelyn stood quietly beside her car, arms crossed, waiting patiently for him to finish. Despite her outward calm, Mark noticed a flicker of irritation in her eyes when he asked additional questions about the vehicle. "I understand you're doing your job," she said finally, breaking the silence. "But I assure you, this is nothing more than a simple mix-up. If you'd like, I can call my brother right now to confirm everything." Mark hesitated. Something about her demeanor unnerved him, not because she seemed guilty, but because she carried herself with such certainty, that it threw him off guard. Was she bluffing? Or was she exactly who she claimed to be? Either way, protocol demanded he proceed cautiously. He nodded curtly and told her to wait while he sorted things out. What neither of them realized at that moment was how this seemingly routine traffic stop would spiral into something far bigger, an incident that would ignite conversations about trust, bias, and accountability. For now, though, both parties stood locked in a standoff, each waiting for the other to blink first. As Officer Mark Reynolds waited for dispatch to confirm Evelyn Carter's identity, the tension between them grew thicker with each passing second. The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet road, and the hum of distant traffic provided an eerie backdrop to their standoff. Evelyn stood beside her car, her arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't shouting or pleading like many people might in her situation. Instead, she exuded a quiet authority that made Mark feel increasingly uneasy. Mark glanced down at the documents in his hands again. The license and registration appeared legitimate, but something inside him refused to let go of his initial suspicion. He had seen too many cases where polished appearances masked criminal intent. People lied all the time. They faked IDs, forged documents, and spun elaborate stories to cover their tracks. Could this be one of those cases? Or was he letting his instincts override logic? "You said you're a judge?" Mark asked finally, breaking the silence. His tone was skeptical, almost challenging. "That's correct," Evelyn replied without missing a beat. Her voice remained calm, though there was a subtle edge to it now. "I preside over family court at the county courthouse. If you'd like, I can provide references or proof of employment." Mark frowned. Family court judges weren't exactly celebrities, but they weren't unknown either. Surely someone of her stature would have left some mark on public consciousness. News article, a community event, anything. Yet try as he might, he couldn't recall hearing about Judge Evelyn Carter specifically. That didn't mean she wasn't telling the truth. It just meant he needed more answers before making any assumptions. "I'll need to verify your story," he said bluntly. "Protocol requires me to make sure everything checks out." Evelyn nodded, though her jaw tightened ever so slightly. "Of course," she said. "I wouldn't expect anything less. But I hope you understand how frustrating this is for me. Being pulled over under these circumstances isn't just inconvenient. It's humiliating." Mark bristled at the word humiliating. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? He was following procedure, doing his job to protect the public. What else was he supposed to do when a car came back as stolen? Ignore it? Let potential criminals walk free because they claim to be important? "It's not personal, ma'am," he replied stiffly. "If your story checks out, we'll get this sorted quickly." Evelyn sighed softly, shaking her head. "You keep saying if. Do you really think a sitting judge would steal a car? Or borrow one knowing it was reported stolen?" Her question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to his radio, relaying additional details to dispatch and requesting further verification. As he did, Evelyn took a step closer to her car, leaning against it casually. To anyone watching, she might have looked relaxed, but Mark noticed the slight tapping of her foot against the pavement, a sign of growing impatience. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly. Cars drove past occasionally, their headlights illuminating the scene briefly before disappearing into the night. Some drivers slowed down to glance curiously at the spectacle. A police cruiser parked behind a luxury sedan, its flashing lights casting red and blue reflections on the asphalt. A few even rolled down their windows to get a better look, whispering to their passengers about what might be happening. One such passerby recognized Evelyn almost instantly. It was Mrs. Thompson, a retired schoolteacher who lived nearby and frequently attended community events where Evelyn spoke about legal reforms. Mrs. Thompson pulled over to the side of the road, got out of her car, and approached cautiously. "Judge Carter?" She called out, her voice tinged with concern. "Is everything all right?" Evelyn turned toward the sound of the familiar voice and managed a small smile. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. Everything's fine, thank you. Just a minor misunderstanding." Mrs. Thompson frowned, glancing between Evelyn and Mark. A misunderstanding? With the police? She sounded incredulous, as if the very idea were absurd. What's going on here? Before Evelyn could respond, Mark stepped forward, raising a hand to signal the older woman to stay back. Ma'am, I'm handling this situation. Please return to your vehicle. Mrs. Thompson hesitated, clearly torn between respecting authority and standing up for someone she admired. After a moment, she gave Evelyn a sympathetic nod and walked back to her car, muttering under her breath about how things work these days. The interruption only added fuel to the fire. Now, not only was Evelyn irritated, but Mark felt increasingly scrutinized. Every glance from passers-by seemed to carry judgment, every whisper a silent accusation. He tried to focus on the task at hand, reminding himself that none of this mattered until he had concrete proof one way or another. Finally, dispatch came through with the information he'd requested. Yes, Evelyn Carter was indeed a sitting judge. Yes, she worked at the county courthouse, and yes, the car she was driving belonged to her brother, Marcus Carter, whose name matched the registered owner on file. There was no dispute. The vehicle had been mistakenly flagged as stolen due to a clerical error. Mark let out a slow breath, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment wash over him. He had been wrong, dead wrong, but admitting that wasn't going to be easy. Ma'am, he began awkwardly, turning to face Evelyn. It looks like there's been a mistake. Your brother's car was incorrectly listed as stolen. I apologize for the inconvenience. For the first time since the stop began, Evelyn's composure cracked. Her eyes narrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line. An apology isn't enough, officer, she said sharply. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a violation of my rights and dignity. You assumed I was guilty without evidence based solely on the fact that I was driving a car that came back as stolen. Mark opened his mouth to defend himself but found no words. What could he say? She was right. He had jumped to conclusions, letting his suspicions guide him rather than waiting for the facts. But admitting that openly felt like admitting failure, not just as an officer, but as a person. I understand your frustration, he said eventually, his voice quieter now. And I truly am sorry. This won't happen again. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing. Then, with a resigned sigh, she nodded. See that it doesn't, she said simply. Because next time I might not be so forgiving. With that, she climbed back into her car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving Mark standing alone under the flickering streetlights. The encounter was over, but its impact lingered, weighing heavily on both of them. For Mark, it was a stark reminder of how easily bias could creep into even the most routine decisions. For Evelyn, it was yet another example of the systemic challenges she faced daily, not just as a black woman, but as someone striving to uphold justice in a world that often seemed determined to undermine it. The next morning, the story of Judge Evelyn Carter's encounter with Officer Mark Reynolds began to spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with posts from witnesses who had seen the traffic stop unfold. Videos captured by curious onlookers showed snippets of the interaction. Evelyn standing tall beside her car, calm but firm, while Mark appeared hesitant and defensive. Some clips even included Mrs. Thompson's brief intervention, adding fuel to the growing debate about what had transpired. For many people scrolling through their feeds, the incident struck a raw nerve. Conversations about race, authority, and accountability were already simmering in communities across the country, and this latest episode seemed to encapsulate all those tensions in one dramatic scene. Comment sections exploded with opinions. Some supported Mark, arguing that he was simply doing his job and couldn't ignore protocol no matter who was involved. Others sided firmly with Evelyn, calling out what they saw as an obvious case of racial profiling, a white officer targeting a black woman based on unfounded suspicion. Local news outlets picked up the story quickly, eager to capitalize on the public's interest. Reporters flocked to the courthouse where Evelyn worked, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or gather statements from colleagues willing to speak on her behalf. Inside the building, however, Evelyn remained focused on her duties. She presided over hearings with her usual poise, refusing to let the events of the previous night distract her from the cases before her. Still, whispers followed her wherever she went. Court staff, attorneys, and even defendants exchanged knowing looks, aware that their judge had become embroiled in something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. Meanwhile, Mark faced a very different kind of scrutiny. Back at the precinct, his fellow officers greeted him cautiously, unsure how to address the situation. His supervisor called him into a private meeting, expressing concern about the potential fallout. "This isn't just about you, Reynolds," Captain Harris said sternly. "It reflects on the entire department. We can't afford another scandal." Mark listened silently, his hands clasped tightly together. He knew Harris was right. The last thing the force needed was more negative attention. In recent years, several high-profile incidents involving police misconduct had eroded public trust, leading to protests and calls for reform. Now here he was, caught in the middle of yet another controversy. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Mark said finally, his voice low. "I thought I was following procedure. How was I supposed to know she was a judge?" "That's not the point," Harris replied sharply. "You made assumptions based on incomplete information. You profiled her because of the circumstances, not because of hard evidence. And now we're dealing with the consequences." The weight of those words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had always prided himself on being fair, on treating everyone equally under the law. But Harris was right, he had made assumptions. The car flagged as stolen Evelyn's composed demeanor, even the fact that she drove an expensive sedan. It all added up in his mind to create a narrative that turned out to be completely false. What scared him most was realizing how easily he could have escalated the situation further, potentially putting both himself and Evelyn in danger. As the day wore on, the backlash intensified. News anchors debated whether the stop constituted racial profiling. Legal experts weighed in on the rights of individuals during traffic stops, and community leaders demanded answers. A local activist group organized a rally outside the police station, holding signs that read "Justice for Judge Carter" and chanting slogans about systemic racism. Even politicians chimed in, using the incident to push for stricter oversight of law enforcement practices. Amidst the chaos, Evelyn found herself at the center of a whirlwind she hadn't asked for. Friends and colleagues urged her to speak publicly, to use the platform she now had to advocate for change. But Evelyn hesitated. She wasn't interested in becoming the face of a movement. She just wanted to do her job and move on with her life. At the same time, she couldn't ignore the significance of what had happened. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever felt unfairly targeted or dismissed because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. That evening, Evelyn sat alone in her living room, staring at her phone as notifications poured in. Messages of support flooded her inbox, along with interview requests from journalists eager to hear her side of the story. She scrolled through them absently, her thoughts elsewhere. Finally, she set the phone aside and leaned back against the couch, closing her eyes. Her brother Marcus walked in a few minutes later, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. He handed one to Evelyn and sank into the chair opposite her. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Evelyn sighed, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wants to scream, and part of me just wants to forget it ever happened. But I can't, can I? Not when so many people are watching." Marcus nodded sympathetically. "You've got a choice to make," he said after a pause. "You can let this define you, or you can use it to make things better for yourself and for others." Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at him. "What do you think I should do?" "It's not about what I think," Marcus replied. "It's about what you believe is right. If you want to stay quiet, that's okay. But if you feel like speaking up might help someone else avoid going through the same thing, then maybe that's worth considering." His words lingered in the air as Evelyn sipped her tea, lost in thought. She knew Marcus was right. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, stereotyped, or dismissed without cause. And while she didn't relish the idea of stepping into the spotlight, she also couldn't deny the responsibility she felt to contribute to the conversation. By the end of the week, Evelyn made her decision. She agreed to sit down for an interview with a reputable news outlet, choosing her words carefully as she recounted the events of that night. She spoke not just about her own experience but about the broader issues at play, the biases embedded within institutions, the challenges faced by marginalized communities, and the urgent need for meaningful reform. Her words resonated deeply with viewers, sparking discussions in households, classrooms, and workplaces nationwide. For some, it was a wake-up call, a reminder of the work still needed to achieve true equality. For others, it was validation of experiences they had long kept hidden, afraid of being dismissed or ignored. As for Mark, the days following the incident were filled with reflection and self-doubt. Internal Affairs launched an inquiry into the stop, requiring him to submit written statements and attend meetings with supervisors. Sensitivity training was mandated, though Mark suspected it wouldn't be enough to erase the damage done to his reputation, to public trust, and to his own sense of integrity. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, Mark stared at his badge resting on the kitchen counter. He had worn it proudly for over 15 years, believing wholeheartedly in its symbolism of service and justice. Now, it felt heavy, burdened by the mistakes he'd made. He realized that rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy, not with the public, not with himself. But perhaps, he thought, it was a necessary step toward becoming the kind of officer he had always aspired to be. Little did either of them know that their paths would cross again soon, not in confrontation, but in dialogue. And when that moment came, it would mark the beginning of a journey neither could have anticipated, one rooted in understanding, accountability, and hope for a better future. The following week, tensions in the community reached a boiling point. Protests erupted outside the police station, with demonstrators chanting slogans like "Justice for Judge Carter" and holding signs that read, "End racial profiling now." The media coverage intensified, with news outlets dissecting every detail of the incident. Social media buzzed endlessly, as videos and eyewitness accounts spread across platforms, fueling debates about systemic racism and law enforcement accountability. Amidst this growing storm, Evelyn's brother, Marcus Carter, finally arrived at the precinct to clear up the misunderstanding once and for all. A tall man in his mid-40s with sharp features and an air of authority, Marcus strode into the building accompanied by two lawyers. His presence commanded attention, and officers immediately recognized him from the reports tied to the case. He wasn't just any civilian. He was the registered owner of the car in question, and more importantly, he was Judge Evelyn Carter's sibling. Marcus wasted no time getting straight to the point. After being ushered into a conference room, he sat down across from Captain Harris and Officer Mark Reynolds, who looked visibly uneasy under his piercing gaze. One of Marcus's attorneys laid out a folder containing documents proving ownership of the vehicle, along with proof that the theft report had been filed erroneously due to a clerical oversight at the DMV. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. "My sister, a respected judge, was humiliated because someone didn't double-check their paperwork. Do you realize how serious this is? How damaging it could be to her reputation and career?" Captain Harris nodded solemnly, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Carter, we understand your concerns, and I assure you, we're taking this matter very seriously." Officer Reynolds followed protocol when he ran the plates, but clearly, there were errors made further upstream. Marcus leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Protocol doesn't give anyone license to treat my sister like a criminal. She was stopped, questioned, and detained without proper cause. That's not just a mistake, it's negligence." Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Up until now, he had avoided direct confrontation, letting his superiors handle the logistics of damage control. But Marcus wasn't willing to let him off the hook so easily. Turning to Mark, he fixed him with a steely glare. "You," Marcus said, pointing a finger. "You're the one who pulled her over. You're the one who assumed she was guilty before checking the facts. What gave you the right to accuse her like that? Was it because she's black? Or because she drives a nice car?" Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the accusation settle heavily on his shoulders. "Sir, I wasn't thinking about race," he stammered. "I saw the stolen report and acted accordingly. It's my job to investigate suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Marcus shot back. "What exactly looked suspicious about her driving? Did she run a red light? Speed? Swerve erratically? No. You judged her based on circumstantial evidence and your own biases." The room fell silent after Marcus's words. Even Captain Harris seemed taken aback by the raw emotion behind them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Evelyn herself entered, the room having been summoned to confirm her side of the story. When she saw Marcus, her expression softened slightly, though her demeanor remained resolute. "Are we done here?" she asked, addressing Captain Harris. "Because I'd rather not waste any more time reliving this ordeal." Harris nodded quickly. "Yes, Judge Carter. Everything has been resolved. Your brother's documentation confirms the error, and the vehicle has been cleared of any suspicion. Again, please accept our apologies for the inconvenience caused." Evelyn crossed her arms and studied him for a long moment. "Inconvenience," she repeated slowly, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's what you call it? An innocent woman accused of grand theft auto? Humiliated in front of strangers while doing nothing wrong? If this happened to someone without my title or connections, do you think they'd receive the same apology, or any apology at all?" Her question hung in the air unanswered. Everyone in the room knew the truth. If Evelyn hadn't been a judge, the outcome might have been vastly different. She might have faced arrest, booking, or worse, a fate far too common for people of color caught in similar situations. After a tense pause, Marcus stepped in, attempting to defuse the situation. "Look," he said firmly, "we're not here to argue. We're here to make sure this never happens again. To anyone. Not my sister, not me, not anyone else who looks like us." Evelyn nodded in agreement but added, "Words are cheap. Actions speak louder. I expect real change, not just lip service. Sensitivity training and internal reviews won't fix decades of systemic issues. If you're serious about reform, start by addressing the root causes of these problems." With that, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, leaving the officers and attorneys to process her parting words. Marcus lingered only long enough to ensure all necessary paperwork was completed before following her out. As they exited the precinct, reporters swarmed them, eager for comments. Evelyn ignored the barrage of questions, climbing into Marcus's car without saying a word. Marcus, however, paused briefly to address the crowd. "This isn't over," he declared, his voice steady and strong. "We deserve better than half measures and empty promises. Justice starts with accountability, and we intend to hold everyone responsible, from the officer who made the stop to the system that allowed it to happen." His statement sent ripples through the gathered crowd, drawing murmurs of approval and applause. For many, it was a rallying cry, a call to action that resonated deeply with those who had long felt powerless against institutional injustice. Back inside the precinct, Mark sat slumped in his chair, replaying the entire scene in his mind. Marcus's accusations stung, not because they were unfair, but because they were painfully accurate. He had jumped to conclusions. He had let bias influence his judgment, even if subconsciously, and now, the consequences of his actions were playing out on a national stage, exposing flaws within the system he had sworn to uphold. Captain Harris placed a hand on his shoulder, breaking the silence. "Listen, Reynolds," he said quietly. "This is tough, but it's also an opportunity. You can either dig in your heels and deny responsibility, or you can learn from this and grow. Which path you choose will define you moving forward." Mark looked up, meeting Harris's gaze. "I don't know if I can fix this," he admitted. "But I'll try, that's all I can promise." Harris nodded approvingly. "Good. Start small. Attend the training sessions. Listen to people's stories. Open your mind to perspectives outside your own experience. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with willingness." As the day drew to a close, Mark found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. He couldn't undo the past, but perhaps he could shape the future for himself, for his colleagues, and for the communities they served. It wouldn't be easy, but then again, meaningful progress rarely was. Little did he know, the road ahead would bring unexpected opportunities for redemption and uncomfortable truths that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness, justice, and humanity itself. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the traffic stop continued to ripple through the community. The incident had become a flashpoint for discussions about race, policing, and systemic inequality. Local leaders called for immediate reforms, while activists organized rallies and town hall meetings to demand accountability. The pressure mounted on the police department, forcing them to take concrete steps toward addressing public concerns. For Officer Mark Reynolds, life became a whirlwind of mandatory training sessions, internal investigations, and uncomfortable conversations. He attended sensitivity workshops led by experts in racial equity and implicit bias, where participants were encouraged to confront their own prejudices. At first, Mark approached these sessions with skepticism, convinced that he wasn't racist and therefore didn't need to change. But as the days went on, he began to see things differently. One particular exercise stuck with him. Participants were divided into groups based on their backgrounds, and each group was asked to share personal stories of discrimination or unfair treatment. Some recounted being followed around stores simply because of the color of their skin. Others spoke of being pulled over repeatedly for no apparent reason. One man tearfully described how his teenage son had been handcuffed during a routine stop, leaving both father and child traumatized. Listening to these stories, Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He realized that what he had dismissed as isolated incidents or exaggerated claims were actually lived experiences shared by countless individuals. Evelyn Carter's case wasn't unique. It was just one example among many of how systemic biases could manifest in everyday interactions. For the first time, he understood why so many people distrusted law enforcement. It wasn't about hating cops. It was about feeling unseen, unheard, and devalued by the very system meant to protect them. Meanwhile, Judge Evelyn Carter found herself navigating her newfound role as an accidental advocate. Despite her initial reluctance to step into the spotlight, she couldn't ignore the weight of responsibility that came with her position. People looked to her not just as a judge but as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even those in positions of power weren't immune to injustice. Evelyn agreed to speak at several community forums, sharing her perspective on the challenges faced by marginalized groups within the legal system. Her speeches were powerful yet measured, blending personal anecdotes with calls for tangible reform. She emphasized the importance of empathy, urging both law enforcement officers and civilians to see each other as human beings rather than stereotypes. "We live in a world where labels define us before we even open our mouths," she said during one particularly moving address. "Black, white, rich, poor, cop, civilian. These labels create barriers between us, making it harder to connect on a basic level. But beneath all those labels were still people, flawed, complex, and deserving of respect." Her words resonated deeply with audiences, inspiring hope in some and sparking reflection in others. Among those listening intently was Mark, who had been invited to attend the same forum as part of his ongoing training. Sitting in the back row, he watched as Evelyn commanded the room with grace and authority. When she finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause, and Mark joined them hesitantly, clapping slowly as he processed her message. After the event, Mark approached Evelyn cautiously, unsure of how she would react to seeing him. To his surprise, she greeted him politely, though her expression remained guarded. "Officer Reynolds," she said, nodding slightly. "I didn't expect to see you here." Mark cleared his throat, feeling nervous under her steady gaze. I wanted to hear your speech," he admitted, "and I wanted to apologize again. In person this time." Evelyn studied him for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "It takes courage to listen when you know the truth might be uncomfortable." Her acknowledgement caught Mark off guard. He hadn't expected kindness, let alone understanding. Encouraged by her response, he decided to push further. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, he continued, about what happened that night, about, well, everything. I realize now that I made assumptions based on incomplete information and maybe something deeper too, biases I didn't even know I had. I'm trying to do better, but it's hard. Really hard. Evelyn softened slightly, her tone less formal now. Change is never easy, she said, especially when it requires looking inward and confronting truths we'd rather avoid. But it's necessary if we want to move forward. They stood there for a few moments longer, exchanging quiet reflections before parting ways. Though their conversation was brief, it left a lasting impression on both of them. For Evelyn, it was proof that growth was possible, even in someone who represented the very institution she often criticized. For Mark, it was a glimmer of redemption, a sign that he wasn't beyond saving. As the weeks turned into months, the dialogue sparked by Evelyn's experience gained momentum. Community leaders collaborated with law enforcement officials to draft new policies aimed at reducing racial profiling and improving police-civilian relations. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, and independent oversight committees were established to review complaints against the department. While progress was slow and imperfect, it marked a significant shift in how the city approached issues of justice and accountability. Mark threw himself into these efforts, volunteering to lead training sessions for rookie officers and participating in outreach programs designed to bridge gaps between police and underserved neighborhoods. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he hoped his actions might help prevent similar mistakes in the future. For Evelyn, the journey was equally transformative. She continued to use her platform to advocate for reform, balancing her advocacy work with her duties as a judge. Though the attention sometimes overwhelmed her, she found solace in knowing that her voice mattered, that her story could inspire others to speak up and demand change. By the end of the year, the city had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. Trust between residents and law enforcement improved, albeit slowly, as both sides worked to rebuild fractured relationships. Conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening openly, fostering a sense of shared purpose and mutual understanding. Through it all, Evelyn and Mark remained symbols of the broader struggle for justice, one representing the resilience of those who endure injustice, the other embodying the potential for redemption. Their paths may have crossed under difficult circumstances, but together, they had helped ignite a movement that promised to reshape their community for generations to come. Months after the initial traffic stop, the city hosted a landmark community forum titled Building Bridges, a Dialogue on Trust and Accountability. The event was organized by a coalition of local leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials who had come together in response to the growing demand for reform. It was held at the Town Hall Auditorium, a sprawling venue filled with rows of chairs, microphones set up for speakers, and banners hanging from the walls that read, "Justice starts with us." The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as people filed into the room. Residents from all walks of life, police officers in uniform, community organizers, and journalists armed with notepads and cameras. Among the attendees were Officer Mark Reynolds and Judge Evelyn Carter, both invited to participate in the panel discussion. For Mark, the invitation felt like both an honor and a test, a chance to prove he had learned from his mistakes. For Evelyn, it was an opportunity to continue advocating for meaningful change while holding institutions accountable. When the moderator called them to the stage, the audience erupted into applause. Evelyn walked confidently to her seat, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit that conveyed professionalism without pretense. Mark followed behind her, his steps slower, more deliberate, as if weighing each movement. As they settled into their seats alongside other panelists, Evelyn glanced briefly at Mark, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. He returned it with a tentative smile, grateful for even this minor gesture of goodwill. The moderator, a seasoned journalist named Lisa Chen, opened the discussion by setting the tone for the evening. "Tonight," she began, "we're here to talk about trust, or rather the lack of it, that exists between communities and law enforcement. We've seen how misunderstandings, biases, and systemic issues can lead to painful consequences. but we're also here to explore solutions, to find ways to move forward together. With that, she turned to Evelyn first. Judge Carter, your experience became a catalyst for many of the conversations happening today. Can you share your perspective on what happened that night and why it resonated so deeply with so many people? Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands resting calmly on the table before her. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. That night was difficult, not just because I was wrongfully accused, but because it highlighted something much bigger than me. It showed how easily assumptions can turn into actions, how quickly someone's dignity can be stripped away based on stereotypes or incomplete information. And unfortunately, my story is not unique. Many people, especially those who look like me, are treated as suspects simply because of their race or socioeconomic status. Her voice grew firmer as she continued. But what made this moment different was the visibility. Because I'm a judge, people paid attention. They saw the injustice and recognized it for what it was. That's why it resonated. It wasn't just my story, it was everyone's story. It reminded us that no one is immune to bias, not even those sworn to uphold justice. The audience nodded along, some murmuring in agreement. Lisa then turned to Mark, her expression neutral but probing. Officer Reynolds, let's hear from you. What has this experience taught you, and how do you think it can shape the future of policing? Mark hesitated, gripping the edge of the table as he gathered his thoughts. This was the moment he had dreaded yet prepared for. The chance to publicly address the harm he had caused. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, though tinged with emotion. I made a mistake that night, he admitted, looking directly at Evelyn before addressing the crowd. I let my assumptions override facts. I judged Judge Carter, not because of evidence, but because of circumstances. And when I realized I was wrong, it shook me to my core. Not just because I had embarrassed myself or the department, but because I understood for the first time how my actions could perpetuate a cycle of mistrust. He paused, glancing down at his hands before continuing. Since then, I've tried to educate myself, to listen to stories I might have ignored before, to confront biases I didn't even know I had. It's been uncomfortable, humbling, and sometimes painful, but it's also been necessary. If we want to rebuild trust, we have to start by admitting our flaws and committing to do better. The room fell silent as Mark finished speaking. Then slowly, applause began to ripple through the audience, starting with a few scattered claps and growing into a wave of support. Evelyn watched him quietly, her expression unreadable, but thoughtful. When the applause died down, Lisa interjected, gently. It sounds like both of you have grown from this experience, she said. Do you think there's hope for real change moving forward? Or are we still too far apart? Evelyn answered first, her tone measured but hopeful. Change is possible, but it won't happen overnight. It requires effort from everyone, law enforcement, policymakers, and ordinary citizens alike. We need accountability, transparency, and empathy. Most importantly, we need to keep having these conversations, even when they're hard. Silence only allows problems to fester. Mark nodded in agreement. She's right, he said. This isn't just about fixing policies. It's about changing mindsets. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and treating each other with respect, regardless of titles or appearances. None of us are perfect, but if we commit to learning and growing, I believe we can create a system that truly serves everyone. As the discussion continued, other panelists chimed in, sharing their own experiences and insights. Residents recounted moments of frustration and fear during interactions with police, while officers described the challenges of balancing safety with fairness. Despite the weight of the topics, the conversation remained constructive, fueled by a collective desire to heal divisions and build a better future. By the end of the evening, the energy in the room had shifted. There was still tension, still unresolved questions, but there was also a sense of cautious optimism. People lingered afterward, exchanging contact information and discussing next steps. Some approached Evelyn and Mark individually, thanking them for their honesty and courage. One woman hugged Evelyn tightly, whispering, "Your strength gives me hope." Another shook Mark's hand firmly, saying, Thank you for owning up to your mistakes. That takes guts." As Evelyn and Mark left the auditorium side by side, they exchanged a brief glance. Neither said anything, but the unspoken understanding between them was clear. They had played pivotal roles in sparking a movement, however imperfectly. Their journey wasn't over, but they had taken significant strides toward bridging the gap between two worlds that often seemed irreconcilable. In the weeks and months that followed, the momentum from the forum translated into action. New initiatives were launched to improve communication between police and residents, including monthly meet-and-greet sessions and joint problem-solving workshops. Schools incorporated lessons on implicit bias and restorative justice into their curricula, ensuring the next generation would grow up with a deeper understanding of equity and fairness. Even legislation changed, with lawmakers passing reforms aimed at increasing oversight and accountability within law enforcement agencies. For Evelyn, the work never stopped. She continued to advocate for marginalized voices, using her platform to push for systemic changes that went beyond surface-level fixes. For Mark, every day brought new opportunities to practice what he had learned, to listen, to reflect, and to serve with integrity. Though their paths rarely crossed after that night, they remained connected by the shared memory of a moment that had forced them both to confront uncomfortable truths. And so, the story of Judge Evelyn Carter and Officer Mark Reynolds came full circle. Not as a tale of conflict, but as a testament to the power of growth, dialogue, and resilience. It served as a reminder that while mistakes could leave lasting scars, they could also pave the way for healing, if we were willing to face them head-on.